many of my friends over the years, they've said, Mike, you should really talk to a psychiatrist. So I've got one on the phone here. His name is Dr. Brock Hollett, and he is a staff psychiatrist in a clinic in Florida. And he formerly embraced Preterism. Many of you will know where we're going with this by now. He embraced Preterism while earning his Master of Divinity at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in 2000 because the Preterist perspective seemed to provide him with coherent arguments regarding the time statements of the New Testament, persuaded by the arguments put forth by Preterist scholars such as R.C. Sproul, Hank Hanegraaff, N.T. Wright, Gary DeMar, and Kenneth Gentry. Dr. Hollett became a teacher at a church with a Preterist orientation and defended Preterist eschatology as the host of a weekly radio program. Wow, and that program was called Fulfilled Life on Covenant Key FM. By 2013, he had finished writing a book defending Preterism and was scheduled to be a conference speaker at a Preterist prophecy conference. Wow. However, on the very night that he received the first book of 100 books from his publisher, the Lord spoke to his heart to re-examine the biblical doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, which led him to repent of his involvement with Preterism. In 2017, God placed a fresh burden on Dr. Hollett's heart to write a book that sets forth a proper biblical eschatology and a roadmap for refuting Preterism. He wrote Debunking Preterism, How Overrealized Eschatology Misses the, quote, not yet, unquote, of the Bible prophecy in only 3 months, sensing a prophetic urgency regarding the project. Debunking Preterism will undoubtedly become the gold standard on the topic of Preterism. The book is replete with a wealth of illustrative figures and comparative charts that reinforce its main concept. Special emphasis is placed upon proper understanding of the, let me go back and say that again. Special emphasis is placed upon a proper understanding of the biblical time statements and the already and not yet principle of eschatology. Wow, that is very well said. That is the introduction on Amazon to the book Debunking Preterism, written by Dr. Hollett. And we have him on the line here. Dr. Hollett, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I went over your book, and it is very well written, very scholarly, with many references, and this is the kind of thing we like to see. I've written 6 books myself. The founder and head of this ministry, Carl Gallups, he's on his 7th, 8th book now, and we place heavy emphasis on the ability to jump out in front of people who say, well, you should consider this person, and you need to talk to this person before you write a book. You've actually got all those bases covered. You have gone to all of the other sources here, like Hanegraaff and Sproul, and you said, look, I was in the mix here. I know exactly what they teach and preach and believe. Let's talk about why that's all wrong. In fact, you basically come out and say that this is heresy. Preterism is heresy. First of all, tell the audience, what is Preterism?
Preterism is a view of biblical prophecy that believes and teaches that the prophecies about the time of the end or the last days have already been fulfilled. There are different types of preterism, but the main portion of preterists believe in what's called partial preterism. So they believe that the coming of the Son of Man happened in the 1st century. They do, however, believe that the return of Jesus is in the future, like the historic church has taught. Contrary to full preterists who believe that the return of Jesus actually happened in the past as well.
Okay. And so now, being heresy, why is that heresy, though? Why is it not okay? Because heresy, I mean, in plain, simple terms, heresy is something that definitely should not be believed by Christians, right?
Correct.
Why is it heresy?
Correct. So with a lot of preterists, even partial preterists, they teach, for example, that the day of the Lord has already occurred, that it happened in the 1st century, in AD 70 when the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem occurred. So they believe that since the day of the Lord has already passed, since the man of lawlessness or the man of sin, like it says in 2 Thessalonians 2, has already revealed himself, since the Great Tribulation, the unprecedented tribulation that Jesus said would never be surpassed, in their view, has already happened. Since they relegate those to the first century, they steal the Christian hope. They steal the things that we look forward to that precede the return of Jesus, and therefore could be I believe, a great stumbling block to Christians who are anticipating the coming of the time of the end.
You mentioned in your book, now let me back up here a little bit, because it always seems to me that because the Bible definitely points to a millennial reign of Christ, a millennium is 1,000 years. It would seem to me that in the year 1000, people would have just given up on all of this stuff and walked away from it, or at least by the year 1070, because the overwhelming belief here within Preterism is that in the year 70 AD, when Titus destroyed the temple, that was the end. I mean, that was when all of the future prophecies became fulfilled, and we have been living in the millennial reign of Christ ever since, right? Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes, so there were, a variety of Christians who, after the year 1000 and shortly thereafter, were disappointed because they believed that they were living somehow in the millennial period. The Preterists, though, I mean, as we know them today, really didn't develop until really the Counter-Reformation. There was a Jesuit priest named Louis Alcazar, who developed Preterism, essentially as a way to sort of thwart the Reformation, to try to dissuade the reformers from doing what God had called them to do. There were some preterist leanings or certain passages that were understood in a past fulfillment type way by Christians throughout, even long before 1000, of course. But the vast majority of Christians were futurists. The first Christians that we know in the first and second centuries were predominantly premillennial, so they believed in a literal millennium that was coming at the return of Jesus. But it makes sense if you're a preterist, if you believe the book of Revelation, or at least the first 19 chapters, were fulfilled in the events leading up to AD 70, and you believe the coming of the Son of Man in some spiritual way happened in AD 70, then of course you're inclined to believe that we're somehow in a millennium period now. So you tend to agree in some sense with the amillennial view. So that's why you find many, if not all, preterists are either I guess there's a few exceptions, but very, very few. They tend to be either amillennial or postmillennial, and not premillennial, like the earliest of the early church fathers taught.
It's amazing to me also, maybe you can speak about this, but you mentioned Alcazar during the Counter-Reformation. Preterism has been described in modern eschatology commentary as a Catholic defense against the Protestant historicist view, which identified the Roman Catholic Church as a persecuting apostasy. So here we have Hank Hanegraaff, who spends a great deal of time attempting to debunk Roman Catholic doctrine, and yet fully embraces a Roman Catholic tenet of preterism, it almost seems like to me.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, Hanegraaff is a case study in and of himself, just seeing his development and how his theology has changed over the years. As many of our listeners know, I mean, Hanegraaff was thoroughly Protestant for the vast majority of his Christian life. He just most recently converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, but it created a little bit of a problem for him. And I don't know exactly where he falls on eschatology now, but I know that up until very recently, if not still, he was very much a preterist and has been for, I don't know, all throughout 7-8 years at least. I do interact with Hanegraaff and with several other, more popular preterists, in addition to a few of the academic guys, just to give so that the book itself is thoroughly interacting with all the different views and arguments that preterists put forth.
You mentioned in your book here, I was fascinated by this. You mentioned in your book that preterist work typically highlight the fallacy of limited alternatives. I like that sentence, where the only option besides dispensationalism is preterism. Their arguments frequently imply the straw man argument that futurism itself must be invalid because the claims of pre-tribulational dispensationalism are erroneous. I love that sentence. That is an awesome sentence. Explain to the audience why that's important.
Okay, so as many of our listeners know, I mean, the idea of dispensational premillennialism. In other words, that there will be a pre-tribulation rapture that could happen at any moment, that will be followed by a period of 7 years tribulation, and then the glorious return of Jesus. That view has been, I think, the predominant view of at least American evangelicalism for, well, I don't know, say since 1850s, maybe something like that.
Right.
Certainly with Schofield and with some of these guys, it's been popularized through the study Bible. It's been very predominant. Now
I
that's
see.
starting to change, but I think that when you look at a lot of preterists, in fact, I would say most partial preterists that I know, they tend to be very familiar with some of the extremes of that view. In other words, what's been popularized with the Left Behind series and many of the more
Yes.
popular dispensationalists, they've been a part of that hook, line, and sinker at some time in the past.
Right.
And in order to correct what they see as, I think, rightfully so at times, some of the extremes of that view, they immediately jump on board with this preterist idea because to them it's a corrective to dispensationalism. But what you don't see a
Uh-huh.
lot of is these guys don't interact with other views, such as post-tribulational premillennialism, which is historic premill. That's what the earliest of the early church fathers taught, and they really don't interact with
Right.
amillennialism. And I mean, if you look at, I would say, most of the academics today in the Christian world, they tend to, in terms of their eschatology, they tend to either be amillennial or they tend to be historic premill. But there's not a lot of interaction with these guys, and I think it's to the detriment of preterists because they're not they're not looking at the other alternatives, and so they sort of have a straw man when they critique futurism as a whole.
It's it's funny because maybe they don't approach all-millennialists because the all-millennialists might say, well, preterism is all-millennialism, basically, because now preterism teaches that we've been in the millennial reign since 70 AD, but it's been almost 2,000 years. So basically, they're saying, okay, we're in the millennium, but it's not really a millennium. It's like millennia, right? Let's get back to what you said earlier about the about the rapture and so on. Now, this ministry, the PNN network, under the guidance of Carl Gallup, we have been attempting to refute and debunk in a loving, compassionate way the pre-trib doctrine, and we've done so with great success. Now, obviously, you and I have not talked about this. I did not know that you were not a pre-trib rapture guy. I did not know that.
Yes, correct. Yeah, I would be a post-trib rapture believer.
Right. Which is basically as if the Bible were read and taken at its most serious level. Most people do come to that conclusion. You have some more to say about this in your book. Where is it here? DeMar, you mentioned DeMar here, another famous preterist, is essentially pessimistic about the practice of looking to current events as fulfillments of Bible prophecies. He employs a pejorative term such as newspaper exegesis to describe this method, but he fails to recognize that the continued search for fulfillment of prophetic events undermines preterism and is evidence of their non-fulfillment in history. That was very well said. Prophecy teachers may not have a calculated the precise date of the eschaton, i.e. the eschatological end, but it is clear that these events have yet to be fulfilled, as preterists suppose. We hope to demonstrate this throughout this book, which you do a good job with that. But then you say, in fact, preterists are guilty of the very newspaper exegesis that DeMar criticizes. They rely heavily on the works of the first century Roman historian Josephus to validate their claims of prophetic fulfillment. Now, Josephus may have been considered back in the days as a investigative journalist, right?
Correct. Yeah. And very important. Very important to understanding the end of the Second Temple period and the events that led up to it, and then shortly thereafter.
Okay. So we've gone through all of that. Now, we have said many times in the past that if a Christian does not look at the Bible prophecies, all of them, Daniel, Revelation, Ezekiel, and all of that, even Isaiah, and even Paul in Romans speaks of a coming degenerate global problem. And here we have in the news last week, we have an article saying that mental disorders, now you may be able to speak to this being a psychiatrist, mental disorders are on the rise in every country on earth. That's the latest on that. And Paul spoke of a coming time when degeneracy and all of these issues will be on a global scale. I believe it's Romans 1. What do you say about that? I mean, if we don't have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the article, or in this case, our smartphones or whatever, Jesus did say, watch and pray, that day, doesn't overtake you like a thief in the night. What do you say about that?
Yes, and Jesus also said, that many's hearts will fail them as they see the things that are taking place on the earth. There's a dread and a fear of an anticipation of bad things, as they see it. Not seeing, of course, that the deliverance of God's people is at hand, and lifting up your heads and rejoicing because your redemption draws near. That's what Jesus told us, to have that kind of attitude, that joyful attitude that sees and anticipate these things with joy, not because the things themselves are joyful, but because that through many sufferings we shall enter into the kingdom, which we have already received through the Spirit, but we will receive in very, our faith will be made sight, to use the famous hymn. So I think that I can't speak directly to the idea that, mental disorders are increasing in every nation. Perhaps they are. I wouldn't be surprised, certainly. But I do believe that, as Paul, mentioned to Timothy, he talked about perilous times that would come in the latter days. That there would be just a plethora of problems as people depart not only from the Christian faith, or professed faith, I should say, but also as they depart from law-abiding mentality. As lawlessness increases on the earth, as people become more and more emboldened by the enemy to fall away from things that are rational and reasonable. I think as these things happen, I certainly think that can contribute to psychiatric disorders. I mean, anxiety is incredibly common. I rarely have a patient who says, no, I really don't experience anxiety. Maybe a couple times a week will I have anybody say something like that, because the reality of it is, anxiety is sort of with us at all times, especially as we have everything on social media telling us so many different stories, so many different narratives. It's easy to get caught up in political worship or in fear about the things that are coming on the earth, instead of trusting in the immutable revelation of God's word and seeking Him in the quietness of the Spirit of Christ. And I think it's important that we do that. You spoke a few minutes ago, you mentioned, Josephus, and I think, as preterists, they'll look at Josephus to interpret the Bible. We also, as futurists, have to be careful that we're not too quick to say this thing that's happening in the newspaper right now or happening on Facebook right now is the fulfillment of this prophecy. I think we need to be very discerning, and we need to rely and trust on the Spirit with asking Him to reveal truth to us, because it's very easy for us to say this is that and this is this, and we need to just be careful. I'm not saying we don't look to current events, but we need to ultimately trust the Scripture itself and the Spirit applying that to us, so that we can have a greater understanding of the things that are coming upon the earth.
I'll be honest with you, Doctor. We could just let all this slide. We could say, okay, you guys just believe whatever you want, and we'll just believe whatever we want, and whatever, right? But for me, the reason I have such a strong urgency to get the message of your book out and just keep talking about this is because of the preterist perspective on Israel, that they believe that Israel was replaced by the church, and the nation of Israel has no business being in that area, in the Levant there. They have no business being there. They should not be there. The church has replaced Israel. And they disregard the prophecies in the Bible, which speak of, okay, in Deuteronomy, God talks about, I don't have chapter and verse in front of me. I wish I was more prepared with that. But it says in there that, and we have that video up on the ppsimmons YouTube channel, by the way, proof for the existence of God. And basically, God talks about, this is how you will know that I am God, that this nation will cease to exist. And a long time after, this nation will rise up again. And this is something that has never happened in history and will never happen again. And we're talking about the nation of Israel. And then we have Ezekiel's dry bones, which talks about this deadness that exists. And Ezekiel said, "Speak to the dry bones," and flesh was put upon them, and so on. And so, as far as we're concerned, that is the greatest aspect of this heresy, is their statements regarding Israel. I mean, elaborate on that for us, if you will.
Yes, and clearly the church has, I mean, we are the pillar and ground of the truth. Jesus calls the church that. If we can't speak to the issue of the crisis in the Middle East and the issue of Israel and Jerusalem, then nobody can. Since the beginning of the scriptures, from the call of Abraham, the Hebrew prophets have been, primarily in Deuteronomy 32, we see the real beginnings of this, but we see that this age, this present evil age, will end in an international controversy over this Jerusalem question. And it's really the issue of an earlier question, the Jewish question, or as some would call it pejoratively, the Jewish problem. I think to answer that question, we have to understand that all believing Jews throughout history, certainly in antiquity, believed in a personal and national resurrection that would happen at the last day. And that would happen after a brief period of unequaled or unparalleled tribulation, or the travail of Zion, if you will. And the Apostle Paul, when he spoke of the transition from that period of trouble to the time of resurrection, this transition to glory, this was the common hope of Israel and for the church. I mean, he called it the blessed hope of the church, and he said this is the hope of Israel. And I believe that that's the same hope. It's the glorious resurrection to the last day. So the question about Jerusalem answers the questions, whose land and on what basis do the Jews have a right to this land? And I think it all underscores God's prerogative to choose whom He will, and it's really it betrays a much larger and decisive issue, and it has to do with the Mideast crisis. I mean, this Mideast crisis that we're starting to see is the climax and the finale of an ancient family feud that goes back to to Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham's children, and it really reveals the intersection that God is able to choose on the basis of something that doesn't have anything to do with what's in man or of man. It's the issue of righteousness and everlasting righteousness, and the solution is Jesus. And so if we look at the issues in the Middle East, and we don't see it as an issue of everlasting righteousness and God's ability to elect and choose whom He will, and not only to choose whom He will, but even despite the fact that Israel has been largely in apostasy during most of her history, that God can take this people and will take this people on the basis of His promises, and He will make them an all-righteous nation in the land. Not just a remnant, but the entire nation will become righteous in one day when they look upon the Lord of glory returning, and when they recognize that He has taken upon Himself not only their sin, but the sin of all the nations. When they realize that, they will be a glorious gem in the midst of the Middle East, and all the nations will come to a greater understanding and knowledge of who Jesus Christ is. So this issue of this little piece of property in the Middle East that we call Israel is not about property. It's about God's ability to choose and elect whom He will, and to actually do what He says He's going to do. And if that doesn't have to do with the Jesus question, I don't know what does.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Wow, what a powerful statement there. It's not about that little bit of land, a little spit of property there. It's about what God chooses to do and not to do, right?
Yes.
I love that. And what do you make, by the way, of Donald Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem? Do you see any prophetic significance there?
I do. I mean, there's no chapter and verse that I'm aware of that says, that an American president will move the embassy. But I think what it does is it brings into focus this ancient enmity. This basically it's bringing into our, I believe, near history. In other words, something that's going to happen in the very maybe even in our lifetime, I think probably in our lifetime, this issue of Jerusalem being the focus of international geopolitics. It will be the crux interpretum of all times. It will be the issue, and I don't say this lightly, I mean the scriptures are clear about this. The issue of Jerusalem will be a cup of trembling for all the nations. I think the kings of the earth are intoxicated with this issue of Jerusalem. This issue of is Jerusalem a harlot city, or is Jerusalem the eternal city of righteousness? And the fate of Israel has been the issue. It's been Satan's special obsession. This issue of the literal Jerusalem and the literal Jewish branches, the Jews, have been the special objects of satanic hatred since the beginning. Since before Cain killed Abel. It's always been God's desire to protect and preserve his people, and it's always been the rage of Satan to destroy God's people and this land and this special place where God has promised to put his king on Zion's hill forever and ever. And I think that if we don't see it as this greater issue, then we're missing the whole point. We've turned it into a political issue. But I do think, the issue of Trump moving the embassy, in these political type issues, it's fascinating because for the first time we see in our time, we see the rage of Satan coming to a climax over this issue of the Jerusalem question. And we see nations who support godliness supporting the issue of Jerusalem. And I think we'll see more of a sifting as time goes on. I think we'll see God's people lining up more and more to support God's plans and efforts, and we'll see the opposite for the children of disobedience. And clearly, Zechariah and the prophets spoke of a time when Jerusalem would be a stumbling stone for all the nations. So this is the final issue that will bring into larger focus the issue of who is Jesus and what is this people and what is God doing with this people that we now call Israel.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up, Dr. Hollett. Debunking Preterism, how over-realized eschatology misses the not yet of Bible prophecy. And that's available on Amazon. Anywhere else they can get that? Do you have another website you want to promote here?
Well, on Facebook, you can look up Debunking Preterism, but I think going to Amazon, you can get the Kindle edition or the paperback there.
Right. Dr. Hollett, thank you so much for coming on. We hope to have you on again very soon. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to PNN Radio. My name is Mike Shoesmith. We'll talk to you next time.
For thousands of years, mankind has debated how creation began. Ancient texts tell us the story. But today, the real message behind the pivotal account of the Garden of Eden has been obfuscated and lost. That is, until now. World-renowned author Carl Gallups digs up the hidden truths from the book of Genesis to finally give back the knowledge that was lost to the world. Find out what really happened in the Garden of Eden, what Jesus taught about Eden on the cross, and how the conflict between Jesus and the gods of antiquity is about to erupt on planet Earth, fulfilling biblical prophecy. In the new book, Gods of Ground Zero, this explains everything.